Hey everybody, welcome to A Gamer Looks at 40. I'm Bill Tucker, and today we have one of our one-shot interviews. Kind of a big ol' interview on a couple of topics that I think are interesting and worth discussing. On today's show, we chat with Greg Sewart. You've heard him on a few past episodes. Right now, he is the co-host of Player One Podcast. He produces Generation 16, which is a YouTube series that tracks every game in the Sega Genesis library. It's a really extensive and interesting series of YouTube videos. I encourage you to check that out. And he's also an alumnus of EGM magazine. If you grew up in the late 90s, early 2000s, EGM was kind of the cream of the crop when it came to video game magazines. I always had GamePro and Nintendo Power. That's just what my mom got me. But it was always fun flicking through those magazines when my friends had them lying around the house. And when we first did our interview, we covered a lot of topics. Some you've already heard. And this segment was meant to be like 10, 15 minutes. It was towards the end of the interview. It went 45, basically the length of this show that you're about to hear. And it was great. We talked about his time at EGM, the differences between print media and digital media, and also quite a bit about journalistic integrity, which I think in the wake of a lot of the current discourse about Metroid Dread and Kotaku basically saying, steal this game, it's not worth $60. I think it's definitely worth listening to all the way to the end to kind of hear our thoughts on, where those lines are. Should you be listening to influencers? Should you be listening to critics? Should you be forming your own opinions based on the swirl of discourse surrounding certain games and certain topics or controversies? So sit back, relax, enjoy this one-shot interview with Greg Sewart here on this edition of A Gamer Looks at 40. And thanks as always for listening. I'd love to pick your brain a little bit about your time in EGM. Sure. What did you do? Were you writing reviews? What was your role there? And what was your kind of experience?
So, while I was at EGM, I actually, when I started at Ziff Davis, I started at Expert Gamer. And there was sort of a big management shuffle at one point that saw me get shuffled over to EGM. Before EGM, I had been working at Gaming Age, or I co-founded the website Gaming Age. And my role there was editor-in-chief. So I was not only writing reviews, but I was editing and assigning and things like that. So that was kind of what, as far as games writing, that's what I was used to. I got the job at Expert Gamer writing guides, mostly because that was my way into the company. Mm-hmm. But when I ended up on EGM after the first month or so, I was given the previews editor position. So what that meant was not that all I did was write previews. I was on the review crew as well. But it was my job to plan the preview section every month. So that entailed sort of at a monthly basis, I was on the phone a lot. I was on the phone with company representatives a lot. And I had this huge, which, God, I wish I still had a copy of. I had this huge database of games as I was just like, I would call random PR person at THQ or Activision or whatever and just chat with them. It's like, let's go over what you got coming up and sort of what are the things that you're looking for coverage on. That absolutely was a thing. It's like, this is a big, important game for us, sort of a tent pole. At the end of the year, we feel like we're going to have playables here. We'll have screenshots at this date, and then I would line those up with our lead time. Because, of course, working in magazines, everything you write doesn't actually hit print for another month or maybe longer, depending on where you're at.
Absolutely, yes.
I think with us, it was like a little over a month, but I know for like GamePro, it was like 2 months. They had a really long lead time. But anyway, so I would take that, and then based on what I knew we'd get, if we were getting a playable or anything like that, I would, and sort of my understanding of the importance and the hype and excitement around a game, or further to that, something that we got in a playable in of that maybe people didn't know too much about, but we had played as a group or even a few of us and said, like, this is great. Mm. And, we're back then, print magazines were still opinion makers. So it's like Eco, as an example, from Sony. That was a game that I think had a little bit of hype, but when we first saw it, we didn't know a whole lot about it, and I don't think a lot of people did. And I remember playing an early build of that game and showing it to a couple other people like Mark McDonald, and was one person I bounced a lot of things off of, and just saying like, this is something I think we need to really cover. Like, we need to give this space and really show people how excited we are about it. So that was a big element of it too. So then it's like, I would put together a section. I'd know about a week into the month how many pages my section was going to be, how many pages I need to fill, and sort of what the ad layout was going to be. And then it's like, okay, so like Eco, as an example, gets a 2-page spread at the beginning of the PlayStation 2 section. And then, we do a full page for an upcoming Tekken game, but it's like 6 months out, so
right.
We know we're going to be covering it a few times. And then we've got like 3 screenshots for the next NASCAR game. So A, we don't have much information or screenshots on it anyway, and B, it's NASCAR. I personally love NASCAR. Our readers didn't, so I still wanted to cover it, but that gets like a third of a page. So stuff like that. And then I would assign them to everyone with deadlines. And then as those came in, I would copy edit them, send them back for revisions, do the layouts basically, or for the bigger ones, the writers would actually do the layouts, and then I would tweak those, and then that would go through our copy editing process. So that was, and then on top of that, of course, I had my monthly allotment of review games to play and write. And for a while, I was actually running the reviews section as well, which is very similar. This pretty much the exact same thing that I just described, but for the reviews section.
Okay.
And then, and then the whole process would start over again. It was a lot of work.
It's a lot because you're also writing reviews during all that editing and editor-in-chief responsibilities. Wow, that's a lot. I'm sure the time investment must be crazy. So I would find it interesting that a lot of the placement of where games, because you're right, because you'd always look at the big title ones, the 2-pagers first, right? That was one you'd turn to in your section. You're like, oh, okay, cool. Let me read this one. And then the other one, you kind of breeze through. Right? If you see something, there's a baseball game. Okay, let me read that little preview. It's interesting that that the companies or the developers had some, not saying that maybe, but at least would let you know, hey, this is something we really want to push. And it sounds like you would take that into account to a certain extent.
To a certain extent, yeah. Now,
right.
it could go the other way too, where there was what was the one? Oh, it was a 3DO game. It was the end of the Army Men franchise, but they were really 100% behind it. It turned into like a weird relationship because, and I think a lot of people back then and even now, actually probably even more now because of the internet and because of this sort of massive distrust of the games press and press in general.
Right.
But there was an element of it back then where it's like, well, this game only got this much coverage or a really good review score because they're bought and paid for. There's an element of truth to that from the coverage standpoint, not necessarily from the review score, at least where I worked. So at Ziff Davis, and at EGM, one of the wonderful things was that, at least during my era, I can't speak for like the early 90s, but during the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a brick wall between us and the business side of the company. So those were people who sold the ads.
Yeah.
They never spoke to us. Like, probably they spoke to Dan Shu, who was my boss for the bulk of the time I was at EGM. He was running the magazine. But if I'm assigned to review Portal Runner, that was the name of that 3DO game I'm thinking of. If I'm assigned to review Portal Runner and the business side of the company wants us to know, oh, by the way, they've bought 10 pages of advertising in this upcoming issue, I wouldn't know that.
Interesting.
And there'd be no pressure. Yeah.
That's great. And that's good. And that's kind of like not where I was leading with that, because there is a lot of that discourse about honesty and games journalism and all of that sort of thing, and who's on the take and who's not on the take. And that's good to hear that, at least back in those days, if I read a review that was, that got a 2.5, let's just say, and then the next page there's an ad for it, which happened not all the time, but you'd see it elsewhere in the magazine. And there's a little bit of dissonance there. You're like, wait, I heard this stinks. Now there's this ad for it. Like, what?
And for what it's worth, and I can only speak, this is only like third hand information, but some magazines, the nice thing about Ziff Davis is we were a huge company and we weren't struggling. So, I know for some smaller publishers, there might have been more of an element of that where it's like, and I have had conversations, and I'm not going to say what game it was for or what company it was or what magazine it was, but I have had conversations where somebody has come to me, and I didn't make decisions on our covers anyway, so this conversation would have been kicked up to Dan Shu, my boss, anyway, but where they've said, like, would you guys be interested in doing a cover for this game? And I felt empowered enough to say no, because I just knew it was something we wouldn't want to put on our cover. And I actually had that person say to me, it's like, I knew you were going to say no, but I had to ask because that's my job. Plus, I know there's a magazine that if I give them a cover, we'll get a good score, blah, 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 blah. So there was an element of that. But at EGM, from the review side, none of that ever happened. Now, from the preview side, it ultimately always came down to our feelings about what was important. Like, at the time that I was there, a new Tony Hawk game, that was cover material every year because they were so popular. So it was like,
that makes sense.
So if you could get information on Tony Hawk, you were running information on Tony Hawk and you were spreading it out over multiple pages. It had nothing to do with how much money Activision spent on your magazine. It had everything to do with the fact that that's what your readers wanted. Same with like Pokemon. Anytime you could run Pokemon, you ran Pokemon.
Sure.
Stuff like that. But again, you would have sort of these, especially on the PlayStation 2, because that system was so popular that you started seeing things like Mr. Mosquito and Mad Maestro and like just these weird games coming out here that didn't fit this market, but was so cool that they were happening. Sure. And when that was happening, there was an element of, that's really cool. We want to make sure our readers know about that. But also you would have, I think IDOS did the two that I just mentioned. You would have the PR person saying like, we're taking a shot with these. It'd be nice if we got some coverage. You don't, I'm not talking about a page because we know you're not doing a full page on Mad Maestro, but I'd really love it if you could fit it in. And so you would take that into account a little bit too, not to sit in, and it was still our own copy. We wouldn't say like, oh my God, you have to go buy this. But, it's like, okay, because at the end of the day, usually something that's lesser known like that, they could use the extra coverage, and you kind of want your readers to know about that because the industry wasn't as big then as it is now.
I feel that a lot, especially, again, I don't do any, I've never done game critique, well, I've done a little bit, but I used to write film reviews, and right now I've been writing for a local Austin site that I cover music for the most part, Austin music. And but I've done like food and beverage. When I was drinking, I did craft beer, and I did a lot of stuff for them. And the poll is always to do like a list because everyone loves a list, and list gets hits. And we actually have a new editor, or new couple who have actually purchased our blog, and they push lists because hey, it's a business, right? They're trying to make some money, and lists pull advertisers. But it's always nice to give coverage to like a small little restaurant that you just like. And what I loved about the site I write for is that I always had that freedom. So if I still went to my editor and said, hey, here's a little southern restaurant in like a strip mall, like the poorer part of East Austin, I want to do a story on it because it's amazing. The answer was always yes. Like, yeah, totally. Now this place, it's not going to get 1,000, 1,500 clicks or anything. It may get like 40, but my opinion of it is if I can get like 10 people to check this place out, and maybe those 10 people bring 3 people each, that's 30 customers.
That's exactly it.
If 10 of them stick around and go back, I am helping. I am really helping this. So it sounds like you had that similar freedom almost with these really small niche titles where they knew you weren't going to give them a cover. They weren't going to get a 2-page spread, but you throw them on the preview page with a cool screenshot. Maybe, I don't even know if they had room for it. And maybe 10 people check it out. And that's now 10 new people who know about this title.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And it was all about that balance. Again, like, if I had gone to my boss at the time and said, we're giving, Mad Maestro 2 pages at the front of the section. And then, we've got some new screenshots for Grand Theft Auto Vice City that are buried 10 pages in, he'd be like, you're fired. He wouldn't fire me. But you know what I mean? Like, that's not me doing my job, right?
Right.
And, and as much as everybody would want to think conspiracy theory, et cetera, like, it's all a balancing act. And it all was back then. Like, you constantly, every now and then we get letters about like, oh my God, it's another Tony Hawk cover. It's like, yeah, because we got to sell magazines. Yeah. Like that. And back then, newsstand sales weren't the biggest thing, but they were still a part of it. And if we aren't selling magazines, we're not getting ads. If we're not getting ads, our magazines get smaller, and eventually we don't exist anymore, which is sadly what happened to a lot of the print industry anyway. But so it's like, I put, and what I mean, the decision makers, not me. But, I put Tony Hawk on the cover so that I have enough room, which is limited, to make sure you get to learn about Mr. Mosquito and Mad Maestro. You know what I mean? That's why. And there were other magazines that took a different tack, like the follow-up to Game Fan. I forget what, Game On or something they were called. I remember they put a game called Stretch Panic on the cover. And it's like, we were excited about that game too because it was Treasure, and we were all, early 20-somethings in the early 2000s. So we all lived through when the rise of Treasure on the Genesis and everything like that. And we would have loved to put something like that on the cover too. It turned out it wasn't a great game anyway, but it's like, it was never in the conversation, and so you would get this sort of feedback from the hardcore saying, see, they're real gamers because they put Stretch Panic on the cover. It's like, yeah, but they're really hamstrung themselves there, because that's not going to sell magazines. As much as you want to think it will, it's not going to.
Yeah, and there is always a business side to anything that's, especially in the reviewing, critiquing world, there's always a business side of it. But I love the idea that you can still be objective and be honest about what you're critiquing while still doing the business side of it, which is selling those ads and putting, sometimes a high profile game gets more space, and it's just what happens. And also those games have earned it because they're good, and a lot of work is put into those. So it's not like the smaller studios certainly put a lot of work into their game, but people tend to forget that these bigger titles, there's just as much work going into them, right? So so it definitely, if they're a higher profile game, it's just what happens. That's interesting. Have you ever had a situation at EGM or any of the publications you've been involved with where you were about to do like a cover or a big story and something just disastrous happened last minute and you had to scramble?
Yep.
Do you have a story?
I do, actually. So that is, do you remember the game State of Emergency?
The name sounds familiar. Yeah.
So State of Emergency was like this 3D, I don't know a brawler maybe, but it was sort of during the height of Rockstar's rise. It was, post Grand Theft Auto 3. I think it was definitely before Vice City, but it was, they were huge right then. Like everyone, they were still surfing the wave of Grand Theft Auto 3. But the month that we put State of Emergency on the cover, it was supposed to be Mortal Kombat. And up until a week before we published, it was Mortal Kombat. And what had happened, I'm trying to remember exactly what the details are here without giving too much detail. What had happened was, of course, there was no playable. It was very early. But again, here's another example of, this was Mortal Kombat. And I think this was the first one in a long time, right? So Mortal Kombat's coming back. Huge. Right. If you look at, and especially as far as sort of the legacy of EGM goes, in the mid 90s, there were stretches of months where the cover was either Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat or both. Like that's just what was all over that magazine forever. So and I think this was going to be an exclusive. Like we've got the exclusive, Mortal Kombat's coming back. This is going to be our cover. It's going to be huge. And what happened was, even though there was no playable, there was supposed to be screenshots.
Okay.
And I believe what happened was we didn't actually get the screenshots. We got concept art, which was great, but the decision was made that, we can't run a cover story that's just about concept art. So we ended up scrambling. And I believe, I think it was Dan Shu who, he would have ultimately made the decision. I can't remember if he put together the whole deal or if some of us were involved as well, but we had to scramble for a cover. And we ended up talking to Rockstar because State of Emergency was coming out. And State of Emergency was not a fantastic game, but because of Grand Theft Auto 3, it was still a game worth putting on the cover. So we ended up, Crispin Boyer ended up writing a cover story for State of Emergency based on God knows what over the space of like 4 days.
Oh,
and that ended up being our cover.
Man.
Yeah.
That is tight. It's interesting. Sometimes you have to make those last minute decisions, right? Assets are always a thing. It sounds like that's always something that can be that can be a thing for sure. Yeah, I've run into that too in the blogging world, where you ask a restaurant or something you're doing a story on, and of course I have a deadline. Everyone has deadlines, and all of a sudden a day beforehand, they hand you a bunch of cell phone pictures they took, are blurry. And you're like, okay, oh no, oh no, oh no.
Yeah.
Do I have to drive out there? What am I gonna do? I totally feel that for sure. Cool, but it sounds like you pulled it out though. Like you guys got together and cover story 4 days. That could not have been fun.
Yeah,
Man.
no, it wasn't. And I will say too, and this is going to sound like I should go before I look up I should look up the review scores for State of Emergency, to make sure I'm not retroactively saying that we were bought and paid for here. But no, it was nice in a way too, because Rockstar, or at least the PR people that we dealt with at Rockstar, they knew we were in a bad spot, and they were very gracious about helping us. They gave us what we needed. They gave us, I think the game ended up scoring 6.5 and 6.5. So I can say this. They ended up, because we obviously had to pull 8 hours to get this done, especially Crispin, again, because he was our features editor and he wrote almost all of this stuff. So there was a fair amount of hey, we bought dinner for the crew, and there was just sort of that. Yeah. It's like, here's everything you need. Plus we're going to grease the wheels a little bit. To get this out here. Because, at the end of the day, they're getting a cover on probably the number one magazine in the country at that video game magazine in the country at that time, too, right? So it benefited them as well. But sure. It ended up being great, and it was a good story. And like I said, I wasn't the one who was mostly affected by it. But
yeah. Well, it sounds like you wouldn't be directly, but it's interesting because a lot of times also you think like the old payola kind of thing, where it's like, hey, kind of like you say, grease the wheels a little bit. Again, I'm glad to hear that that didn't affect the score. Hey, this is a 6.5, and you put it on the cover and you gave it a shot. And sometimes those cover stories pan out and they just don't. I'm sure there's plenty of examples where you had a cover story, y'all were interested in it, you were psyched, the previews look amazing, this looks really good, and then all of a sudden, comes out and you're like, ugh, dang. Not quite, but this, that's hit or miss, right? Especially previews, right? Because you're basically getting what they're giving you, essentially.
Yeah, there's an art form to that, right? And that was one of the things that we started to change a little bit during my tenure there. Was we wanted to try not to just be doing a sales pitch for the game every time, but you have to be careful. You had to be careful. You didn't go the other way. Right? Where it's like, because I mentioned previously chatting about playing a very early version of Eco by Sony, and it ended up being a fantastic game. And even in that early preview version, it was a really good game, and I was really enjoying what I was playing. But I wish I had that preview build now, because wow, did it ever end up being a completely different game when it came out? There's a lot of changes that happen there. So it's kind of a great example of, even when you're into like the beta phase of something, especially in such a creative endeavor like video games, it can change so drastically in the final few months.
Oh yeah.
That, you don't want to go crazy and do super fanboy like sales pitches on things, but at the same time, you don't want to tear apart an unfinished game as well, because that's really not fair. So, you kind of try to balance it out a little bit as much as you could, but you kind of always still erred on the side of positive, because at the end of the day, people were still working away on it. God knows what's going to happen. Right.
Yeah, you really can't blast something too much if it's early on. And again, in my world, it's the blog I write for, we are very big on, if we don't have something nice to say, don't say it. Mm-hmm. But then you run into the issue, where does this sound like you said, a commercial? You're writing commercials for these places. So there's a really important balance in tone too, I think, in how you write these things. It's very interesting, that kind of balance that you have to strike, for sure. Do you think something is, and this may be like a leading question, and I hope it isn't, Do you think something is lost in that transition from the physical to digital? Or is it kind of just a different form of way of getting information?
I think I think there is something lost, and I want to make like it's hard to say this without sounding like, we were special. We were more capable of doing this than people are today. And that's not it. That's not what I'm saying at all. But it was kind of like having back then where you had a certain amount of national magazines, and I'm just talking about North America here, because obviously there were magazines all over the world for video games. You kind of, it felt like it could be a more trusted resource than it is now. The internet's fantastic. I started my career on the internet. I mean, where I came from as far as games journalism go was starting my own website, because that was something you could do in the mid 90s. And it was sort of the first time you could do it. But, now I feel like we've lost a couple of things. The deadlines, I'm glad I don't work in games media anymore online, because the deadlines are nuts. And
I can imagine,
right?
It's so immediate. Everything is now.
Exactly.
Right?
And I mean, like you had tight deadlines back then, but you were kind of a slave to your lead time, right? So it's like your deadline had more to do with, we got to get this to the printer so that it can be shipped and it's on newsstands in a month, right? Whereas now it's like, my understanding is we've got to get this written now because someone else is going to post it. And if we're 5 minutes late, that's X thousands of clicks or views that we're not going to get. So the pressure is so insanely high that I feel like there's not as much care taken. And I don't blame the people who are writing this stuff for not taking that level of care, because there's no time for it. Now, that being said, there's some great reporting happening now too that you weren't getting back in the magazine days, because the flip side is, you don't have as much as in the way of space limitation that you did back then, right? Like there's some fantastic long form reporting in the video game industry happening that you did not get 20 years ago. And but they're more evergreen stories. They're not necessarily breaking news.
Right.
And then the other thing, I feel like for all the sort of payola bought and paid for commentary that can happen and did happen over magazines, you knew what the relationship was, or at least you had an inkling of what the relationship was. It's like, I'm reading a magazine. If you have a little bit of knowledge about how money works, you know that the ads in the magazine are paying for the space. So, it's like, yes, I'm reading a review of Call of Duty here. And yes, there was an ad for Call of Duty, or yes, Call of Duty was on the cover. I'm deciding whether or not that affected the review score, et cetera, et cetera. Now, especially in the age of influencers, and again, there are some great ones, don't get me wrong.
Yep, I agree.
But that relationship is largely hidden now. And I don't think it's done us any favors. I hate to sound like a conspiracy theorist. I hate to sound like the people who wrote us angry letters asking why we gave something a 9.5 when it clearly deserved a 10, and we're biased and all that sort of thing. But it's like, at the very least, not knowing if so and so who has millions of viewers and who is praising this game up and down is receiving any kind of sponsorship money from the publisher, or if they got a free copy of the game, and it's not just video games, it's everything. Like toy reviews, I know online are a huge issue there too, where these influencers are getting product demos, right? They're getting the stuff for free. So, if there's, I remember back when I was doing websites, there was an element of that. I remember the first time I got a game for free, it was amazing. It's like, wow, this is a thing that can happen. And it definitely colored my view, but I also got sort of used to it, and especially when you get into a professional environment where that's the norm, and it's not being sent to you, it's being sent to the company, and you're not taking it home, it's not part of your collection now. I think that it grounds you a little bit more, and I feel like we're sort of in the infancy of that as far as the online influencer goes.
Influencers culture is very interesting, because I always view them as marketers.
They are.
They're just marketers, right?
Yeah.
I assume anything an influencer is promoting, they got for free. They did not buy that thing. Influencers should be disclosing that. They're supposed to be. The blog/site I write for, we are like low level influencer level, about 40,000 on Instagram. And this is not a flex, but in the 7 years I've been with them, I've gotten many free restaurant things and meals, and like I'll be going to Austin City Limits Festival tomorrow through Sunday. I have a credential, right? I'm gonna be covering it, and I'm gonna be doing an article on it at the end of it, and it's gonna be about my experience. And am I gonna be negative? I'm gonna be positive. I'm gonna be honest. How honest am I gonna be, right? Because this is my 5th Austin City Limits Festival in a row, and I always get my media credential. So it's that balance is super hard to do. And I've done those videos where, I get some food product from somebody and I put it on we post it to our Instagram and I make a video and I do a thing. I always err on that side is disclose it really carefully, make it purely, I got this thing for free. It's not coloring my opinion. And the site that you're viewing this on, we are generally going to be positive about something. That's just what we do. But again, like we were saying, where's the guideline? Where's the balance between writing a fluff piece, on the Austin City Limits Festival? I mean, it's going to rain. It's COVID. Walk around with a mask. Right. I'm going to be dead tired at the end with 80,000 other people. There's lots of negatives, but there's also positives. So what my goal is, I look for the positives in that, and that's what I'll show. And I'll also kind of just tell the story of my experience at the festival. So it's a very interesting thing. It's just kind of happens. And again, influencers are marketers.
And I mean, I want to be sure that I'm clear about the fact that I'm not saying that we were like completely, I don't know, what's the word, unindictable when it comes to this stuff.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
I mean, it absolutely did happen. And I learned as I left the games journalism industry and actually got into game development and realized what a nobody you are once you get into game development. No offense, but it's like no one's taking you on press junkets anymore or sending you free games or anything like that. Right. It was a bit of a culture shock, and we've talked about this on our podcast, Player One, multiple times, where it's like I got so used to having access to everything that I actually had terrible spending habits when I left because I don't want to play everything, so I have to buy it now, right?
Yep, but that's interesting.
Sure. There was a safety net around that. Like when we were working at EGM, we were not privy to the ads that were being sold, nor were we pressured to cover anything based on the ads being sold. When I wrote a review, if I gushed a little bit too much, one of the policies we had at EGM under Dan was, you've got to be able, Dan and Mark, I should say, because Mark ended up being the reviews editor as well, and Mark McDonald was a fantastic reviews editor. His policy and Dan's policy were you need to be able to defend this, whether it's positive or negative. You need to be able to defend it to me. You need to be able to defend it to the developers and the publishers, because sometimes, as an example, and this did not happen with State of Emergency, don't get me wrong, but I'm going to use it as an example because I know what the scores are now. But like where we gave State of Emergency 6s across the board, we were separate from the business side of things, but that also meant that if we pissed off one of the advertisers, we would hear about it. And there were multiple times while I was there, and I wasn't the only one, where I'm sitting on a call with my boss, with Dan, where they're saying like, what the hell? We spend a lot of money on your magazine. Why did you give this game a 6? Right? And while Dan, to his credit, was always on your side, right? Like he was there to defend you and the magazine. You were expected to be able to justify your score, not only to Dan, but to the advertiser, if that ever happened. And it didn't happen a ton, but it did happen. And I feel like the influencer culture that we have right now, that's the piece that's missing, where it's like, along with disclosure is absolutely huge.
That's huge.
But on top of that, it's like it's the editors and the safety net and the multiple edits. Because when we were getting, I mean, all of our stuff went through copy edit, which is a different thing, you know, as far as like grammar and spelling and all that sort of thing.
The filter.
Yeah. But it also got filtered by like, and I was actually part of the process a little bit too. So like I would give reviews the first look. And I remember a few times going to Mark, who was the reviews editor, and saying like, you know, this score doesn't really match this text, or I feel like this text needs more detail so that, you know, it can justify this score. And then if he agreed with that, it would go back to the writer and they'd either rewrite it or they would defend it. And then, you know, anything that I missed, Mark would do, including my stuff, where it's like I had multiple conversations with Mark where he's like, explain this to me, you know, because the text doesn't explain it. So, or if it's something that he happened to have played as well, or or we had multiple reviewers, it's like, okay, you scored this a 6, everyone else scored it a 9. Why? You know, they're not necessarily saying you have to change your score, but tell me why you gave it this much lower score. Right. And so there was a safety net there and an element of that. So not saying we always got everything right, not saying there wasn't some bias. There obviously was. Everyone has some inherent bias.
Yes.
But, you know, you had this filter that protected the integrity of the magazine and of your reviews that I feel like sort of influencer culture just doesn't have, because it's usually one person sitting in front of a camera. Why would they have it?
And it's interesting because you also mentioned integrity. I think that is a big keyword in this kind of conversation of the differences between then and now. And I liked how you said you have to defend it, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I used to review film. I was a film critic for a long time, part-time film critic amongst doing other things and real work and whatnot. And my feeling was always, and this is something I don't think happens as much anymore, is I always wrote my reviews as if the director was reading them. Mm-hmm. As if they were actually, or as if they were sitting right in front of me. And it's kind of like that defending, like you were saying. Yep. I never liked writing bad reviews. I never liked it because I have to spend more time with something I didn't like. I like analyzing and critiquing and, you know, using my set of my critical belief system to evaluate something as objectively as I humanly can, you know, because we can't all be perfectly objective. And I enjoy that. But it was hard because now I have to craft this in a way where I have to be honest, but not mean. You know,
yes.
Like I once time I wrote a review of Sucker Punch, which I despised that movie. I despised it, and it was pretty scathing. And I remember getting it published and reading it after. I'm like, that was too much. There was no editor or anything kind of reviewing. It was just my own site or my own or some small literary site where they didn't really care. And I was like, oh man, I really hope Zack Snyder doesn't read that because I didn't mean to be, I don't want to be mean, you know, you learn, but
little did you know that you were actually Zack Snyder's first stop every morning.
Yeah, that's right. You always check the, exactly. That little site on the corny internet. Yeah, that person's usually pretty nice. I like the way that guy thinks. He's kind of, his beliefs, his viewpoint's kind of similar to mine. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I think it's interesting. And also when we talking about the differences between, the digital and print, there's something more basic for me. I just miss the tactility of a magazine. I really love, at my mom's house, I'm sure, hopefully they're still preserved in some sort of dust. I have 8 or 9 years worth of Nintendo Powers just sitting there. And I have some Game Pros and some, no offense, I don't think I ever bought EGMs. I had friends who had them, so I read them there. It was just, I got them for Christmas. Look, I got the subscriptions for Christmas, and that's how it happened. But I always like reading. Everyone always told me EGM's a better magazine. Why do you read Game Pro? I'm like, it's what my mom gets me. I don't have a choice in this. But I love just going down there and just flicking through an old magazine, just feeling the tactility. And there's an intimacy, I think, with it as well that's missing from digital. During our time of our conversation, I have now like 15 Slack messages, 10 emails. I'm like a fly. I keep glancing at other things, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're reading online, you're easily distracted, and because everything is vying for our attention. Mm-hmm. And when you're with a magazine or a book, you know, again, this makes me sound like an old fart, but when you sit down with that, it's just you and that book. There's nothing else even reading on my phone, a text message comes in, this alert comes in. Everything's competing. But when you have a piece of physical medium in your hand, it's just you and that piece. And I really like that, and I miss that. I was a magazine guy for a long time until it didn't make space sense. Like, where am I going to put this collection? I have children. There's no room for anything.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
No room. Yeah. So.
But I agree with you. I mean, and it also, I think, for people our age too, where we lived in a time where that was where you got your information. I mean, I have, same as you, I have a couple of old, I have a decent collection of old Nintendo Powers, EGMs, and game fans. And, some of those game fans, especially just because they were so well known for their wonderful screenshots. I mean, my friend Jim and I, those things are worn out because we would go over every screenshot with a fine-tooth comb, especially if it was something like, I remember when they started covering Street Fighter 2 on the Genesis, comparing it meticulously with what we knew from the Super Nintendo, like what we'd played. And it's like, okay, so
cool.
The letterboxing is different, and the like we knew down to the pixel what was different on those screenshots. But that's just what you did. And and when a new one came out, if you had a subscription, great. When a new one came out on the newsstand, like we'd go to the newsstand every other week to see if there was a new video game magazine. Mm-hmm. It was great. I loved it. And so there's a nostalgia factor for that. I mean, I have the first issue of Expert Gamer that I was ever in sitting right here, just because someone sent it to me for a video that I want to do, and I was missing this in my collection, and they very generously sent me a copy. And it's just like, man, it's also nice because it's such a time capsule.
Yes.
And that's the other thing with I think digital media, which is great for all the other reasons. That stuff gets lost. I can't find things I wrote 15 years ago online that were published. I mean, like OneUp.com shutting down.
Oh,
I had features on there that are just gone.
Oh, you
now.
did? Cool. Oh yeah. That's Yeah, no, I agree. It's funny. I think back to the things I wrote 10 years ago. I'm like, I'm glad I can't find it. I'm sure they're not good.
That's fair. That's a good point.
That's not saying yours wasn't good, but I'm just me personally. But it's interesting. Yeah, it does kind of get lost in the bits and the bytes. Yeah, man. But the good news is there's still a lot of good places out there to get, to get what you want, as long as you're willing to kind of hunt around. And find it. Not to plug it, but I have my friend. He's goes by the Well-Read Mage on Twitter, and he has a site called The Pixels, and it's all about objective criticism in a world full of clickbait. And
cool.
it's whenever anything they write goes on, like they do like a 10-point scale of different aspects of the game. I don't know if I love that too much, but that's just how they do it. But everything for them is like they try to create long form. It used to be very long form reviews. Now they've kind of shortened it because that's just the world we live in. But it's about objective criticism in, again, a world of like clickbait.
Cool.
So there's and I contribute to that on occasion, and it's an interesting thing. You can find that stuff. Like I have there's certain YouTubers like Noah Caldwell Gervais. I adore his work. It's these long form YouTube videos about certain games and comparisons, and it's fantastic. And he goes into a depth, and it's interesting, and it's objective, and it's just awesome, So anyway, the stuff is out there if you're willing to mine for it. But unfortunately, the mass media, again, influencer culture, it's just hard. You just have to kind of take it all with a grain of salt. And honestly, I always say, and this is one final thing. We'll kind of close up. Thank you again for going a little long. Even if a review is like a 7.5, buy it anyway if it sounds interesting. There are so many fun 7.5s out there that you may love, and it's like $3 on Steam. Right?
That's the huge thing for me, and because you have a lot of people, especially when you're talking older gamers and the nostalgia that goes along with that. It's like gaming was better back then, and it's like I kind of agree, but in a lot of ways I really don't, because there are so many. I find it's harder to find. You can't play everything anymore. That's the huge difference. Like in the 90s and early 2000s, except for genres that I really didn't like hardcore strategy and stuff like that, or football games, I didn't play those because I just wasn't interested in them. But if it was like something that I was even remotely interested in, I could play it, and I was pretty well versed in like everything that came out. You can't do that anymore because the amount of stuff that's coming out now is so insane. But that's such a wonderful thing, because if there's any interest you have, there's a video game about it.
Yes,
and
exactly.
usually a good one.
Yep.
And the price, the delivery system is so much easier now. The pricing is so much better now. Yes, packaged games and AAA games are more expensive, but like you just said, and not even Steam, you have to go on too. Like with Xbox and PlayStation and Switch, you usually get good sales.
Yeah,
it's so much better now.
It is, and I do think there's value in those lesser knowns, and that's why I tell people. I've had this conversation with people as well, who'll say, oh, I don't trust critics. I don't read reviews. I just go off the score, which again is fair. We all have, a lot of us don't have time, right? We just kind of we grab the information that we can grab and we just go with it sometimes. But I always tell people, just find a critic you like, who shares like a similar. Don't listen to everyone, but find one you like that. Like, yeah, this guy loves XYZ game. So do I. Maybe we have a similar perspective, and then go off of what that person says if they recommend something. It's just aim for those 7.5s and those 7s. There's probably fun to be had.
That's where the gold is.
Yeah, and that's where the fun stuff, and that's where you can get away from the crazy discourse and maybe have your own discourse about this cool thing. And you find a community of people who like the cool thing.
Absolutely.
And then you can ignore the people who are complaining about Call of Duty and the big things. Find your pockets.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
I wrote an article, I think it might have been last year at this point, on the Pixels. It was about how I've learned as an older person to kind of kill hype to preserve joy. It's an article about how kind of about that. Like, let's lower your expectations so you can learn to enjoy things that may not reach those expectations you've had built up in your head.
Yeah.
It was more tongue in cheek than anything else, but there's some truth in it. But yeah, that's I just think there's a value. Play those 7.5s. Just go for it. If it sounds interesting and it's $3, what have you got to lose?
Exactly.
Hey, you made it to the end. Thanks for that. I just stole that from Rich Eisen. I am citing my sources, okay? I am being a responsible podcaster, okay? That's what I just did. Thanks so much for listening. If this is your first time to the show, welcome. Please do all the podcast things like rate, review, share. More people get involved, the more stories we can tell, so all of that is greatly appreciated. Next week's episode gets us back on track in the 16-bit era, and it's a doozy. I'm not gonna spoil it here because it may not happen, because life happens, but it should be a doozy. If you want to hear it, download the next episode of The Gamers Looks at 40. Until then, thank you for being awesome.